when I finally exposed our church leader for stealing over $300,000 in donations. The look on his face, as I presented the evidence to the entire congregation, was worth every sleepless night. For years, he had manipulated us all, but that Sunday morning, as I calmly laid out the financial records in front of everyone who had trusted him, I watched his carefully constructed kingdom crumble. It was a crisp autumn morning when I first noticed something wasn't right. The church fellowship hall was filled with the familiar scent of coffee and cinnamon rolls as members mingled before service. I'd been the volunteer financial secretary for our community church for over 15 years. Not the most glamorous position, but I took pride in helping our modest congregation manage its resources responsibly. I was reviewing some donation records at a corner table when Pastor Richard Morgan swept into the room. He had that effect on spaces. His entrance changed the energy, drew eyes, commanded attention. 6 feet tall with salt and pepper hair and a booming voice that could fill the sanctuary without a microphone, he'd led our church for 7 years and transformed it from a struggling congregation to a thriving community hub. "Good morning, faithful servant." His hand landed heavily on my shoulder, making me jump. His smile was wide, teeth perfectly straight and white, but his eyes didn't match. They never quite connected with mine. "Working hard or hardly working?" I returned a polite smile. "Just double-checking the youth mission trip numbers." "Don't worry yourself about that." He waved dismissively. "God provides, and we're blessed with generous hearts in this congregation. Speaking of which, I'll need to transfer some funds for the building expansion. The committee approved it last night." I frowned slightly. "I wasn't aware of a committee meeting. Last-minute thing. Email notifications must have had a glitch." He slid a form across the table. "Just need your co-signature for the transfer." Something felt off. The building expansion had been discussed for months, but the plans weren't finalized, and we were still in the fundraising phase. "I should review the meeting minutes first," I said carefully. His smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. "The minutes aren't typed up yet, but we need to move quickly. The contractor needs a deposit by Monday." "Which contractor did we go with?" I asked, pen hovering above the paper. "Cornerstone Construction." He checked his watch. "Look, I need to prepare for the service. Can we just get this done?" I signed, against my better judgment. Richard had built our church into something special. Who was I to question his leadership? But as he walked away, I couldn't shake the unease settling in my stomach. That signature was my first mistake, or perhaps my first step toward the truth. The next week, I was reconciling our monthly statements when I noticed the transfer. $45,000 had gone not to any construction company, but to an LLC I didn't recognize. When I Googled it, I found nothing. No website, no business listings. I told myself there must be an explanation. Perhaps it was a parent company or a financial holding entity. I made a note to ask Richard about it at our next finance meeting. But that meeting was suddenly cancelled, and the next one, and somehow, Richard was always too busy to discuss the financial questions I'd emailed him. "The Lord's work keeps me running," he'd say, with that same tight smile whenever I tried to corner him after services. 3 months passed. The building expansion hadn't started. When I asked about it at a church council meeting, Richard announced that they were reassessing plans to ensure the best stewardship of resources. The explanation satisfied everyone else, but it only deepened my concerns. That night, I stayed late at the church office. As the volunteer financial secretary, I had legitimate access to our records. What I found turned my stomach. Over the past 2 years, nearly $300,000 had been transferred to various LLCs and consulting companies. None of these expenditures had been properly approved by the church council. The paperwork had my co-signature on every transaction. Some I remembered signing, others looked like my signature, but I had no recollection of approving them. I printed copies of everything and took them home, tucking them into a manila folder I kept in my desk drawer. I wasn't ready to accuse anyone yet. I needed more information. The next Sunday, I watched Richard with new eyes as he preached passionately about integrity. "Honesty before God is the cornerstone of our faith," he thundered from the pulpit, his voice rising and falling with practiced precision. "We cannot hide our actions from the Lord. What is done in darkness will be brought to light." The congregation nodded and murmured their agreement. I sat silent, the knowledge of those financial records heavy in my mind. After the service, I approached Diane, our church administrator, who had worked closely with Richard for years. Diane, do you know anything about Cornerstone Construction or Eagle Vision Consulting? She frowned. Eagle Vision? That's Richard's personal business, I think. Some kind of leadership consulting he does on the side. Why? My heart sank. Just trying to organise some paperwork. Thanks. I went home and did more research. Eagle Vision Consulting was indeed registered to Richard Morgan. So was Cornerstone Holdings LLC and 3 other entities that had received church funds. He was funneling church money into his own companies. I didn't sleep that night. Or the next. What should I do? Go to the police? Confront Richard privately? Take it to the church elders? I had evidence. But would anyone believe that their beloved pastor was stealing from them? I decided to gather more information before making any moves. I started by talking to former church staff members who had left suddenly over the past few years. Their stories were remarkably similar. They'd questioned financial decisions, expressed concerns about transparency, and found themselves pushed out. He made me feel like I was crazy for asking questions, said Melissa, our former youth director. Then he told the elders I was difficult to work with and undermining church unity. James, who had served as associate pastor until last year, was more blunt. He's a con man in a collar, but nobody wants to see it because he tells a good story and makes everyone feel special. I collected their statements, promising to keep their names confidential for now. The folder in my desk drawer grew thicker. Then came the email. It was from Richard to the church elders, but he had accidentally copied all staff and volunteer leaders. We need to discuss the ongoing issues with our financial secretary, he wrote. I'm concerned about increasing signs of cognitive decline and possible financial impropriety. Several reconciliation errors have been discovered, and while I've tried to address this privately, I believe we need to take more formal action to protect the church's resources. I stared at my screen in disbelief. He was setting me up, preemptively discrediting me before I could expose him. The next day, Elder Thomas called me. Richard is concerned about you, he said gently. He thinks you might be overwhelmed with the financial responsibilities. Would you consider stepping down? I appreciate the concern, I replied, keeping my voice steady. But I'm quite capable of continuing my duties. In fact, I've been reviewing our financial records carefully and have some questions I'd like to discuss at the next council meeting. There was a pause. Richard suggested we might give you a special recognition for your years of service. Make the transition honourable. That won't be necessary, I said. I'll see you at the meeting on Thursday. As soon as I hung up, I knew I needed to move quickly. Richard was orchestrating my removal. Once I was out, he could blame any financial irregularities on me. The perfect scapegoat. I reached out to my nephew, an accountant at a major firm. Without revealing details, I asked if he could review some financial records for me. Professionally, confidentially. Bring them over tonight, he said. 3 days later, I had his analysis. It was worse than I thought. Beyond the transfers to his own companies, Richard had been manipulating donation records and using church credit cards for personal expenses. My nephew's professional opinion was unequivocal. This is embezzlement, plain and simple. The quarterly congregational meeting was scheduled for Sunday after service. Richard had added a special agenda item, financial office restructuring. He was going to use this meeting to remove me publicly. I spent the next 2 days preparing. I made copies of all the evidence, bank statements, transfer records, the registration documents for Richard's companies, my nephew's analysis, and testimonials from former staff. I organised everything into packets, one for each church elder and council member. I also sent a carefully worded email to our regional denominational office, outlining my concerns and the evidence I had gathered. I didn't accuse. I simply requested guidance on how to properly address financial governance concerns within a congregation. Their response was immediate. They would send a representative to our Sunday meeting. Sunday arrived. I dressed carefully. A conservative blue suit, minimal jewellery, hair neatly styled. I wanted to look composed, professional, credible. The folder of evidence sat in my tote bag, its weight reassuring. The service proceeded normally. Richard preached about trust and unity, his voice resonating through the sanctuary. "A house divided cannot stand," he declared. "We must trust those whom God has appointed to lead." I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, waiting. After the service, the congregation gathered in the fellowship hall for the meeting. About 200 people settled into chairs as Richard took his place at the front, flanked by the elders. I noticed a woman I didn't recognize sitting near the back, middle-aged, with a portfolio on her lap. The denominational representative, I presumed. Richard opened with prayer, then moved efficiently through the standard agenda items. Finally, he reached the point I'd been waiting for. "Now, we need to discuss an important restructuring of our financial oversight," he began, his voice grave. "For some time, the elders and I have been concerned about inconsistencies in our financial management." He didn't look at me as he spoke, addressing the congregation with sorrowful eyes. "Our long-time financial secretary has served faithfully for many years, but we believe it's time for new systems and possibly professional oversight. We've noticed some concerning patterns that suggest," he paused delicately, "that perhaps the complexity of our growing church finances has become overwhelming." Murmurs rippled through the room. Several people glanced my way with pitying expressions. "Therefore," Richard continued, "we propose transitioning to a professional accounting service and creating a new financial oversight committee. We want to recognize the years of service given and allow our current financial secretary to step down with dignity." He finally looked at me, his expression a perfect mask of compassionate concern. "Would you like to say anything?" he asked, clearly expecting a tearful, confused response that would confirm his narrative. I stood slowly, picking up my tote bag. Yes, I would. My voice was calm, clear, and carried across the suddenly silent room. I walked to the front, standing not beside Richard, but across from him. I placed my bag on the table and removed the folder. "I've served this church as financial secretary for 15 years, I began. "In that time, I've worked with 3 different pastors and seen our congregation through financial challenges and blessings. I take the stewardship of our resources very seriously." I opened the folder and removed the first set of documents, which is why, when I discovered financial irregularities, I felt obligated to investigate thoroughly before bringing my concerns forward. Richard's smile faltered slightly. "I think this demonstrates exactly the confusion I was referring to." "Please allow me to finish, Pastor Richard," I said, my voice firm but polite. "As I was saying, I discovered irregularities. Specifically, I found that over the past 3 years, approximately $300,000 of church funds have been transferred to outside entities without proper authorization from the church council." The murmuring grew louder. Richard's face hardened. "These entities," I continued, holding up the registration documents, "are all registered to Richard Morgan, Eagle Vision Consulting, Cornerstone Holdings, Visionary Leadership Institute, all owned by our pastor." Richard stepped forward. "This is a misunderstanding. Those are legitimate ministry partnerships. I have the bank records showing transfers from our church accounts to these companies," I said, placing them on the table. "I also have evidence that my signature was forged on several authorization forms." The room erupted in confused conversation. Elder Thomas stood up. "These are serious accusations. Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "With respect, Elder Thomas, this concerns everyone here," I replied. "These are your donations, your tithes, your offerings that were given in good faith to support our church's ministry." I turned to address the congregation directly. "I've had these records reviewed by an independent certified accountant, whose analysis I've included in the packets being distributed now." 2 church members I'd asked to help began passing out the packets to the elders and council members. Richard's face had gone from confident to thunderous. "This is slander. I've dedicated my life to this church, while you've been making bookkeeping errors that I've graciously overlooked." I didn't respond to his accusation. Instead, I held up a stack of emails. I also have correspondence showing that Pastor Richard was planning to remove me from my position
and suggest that financial discrepancies were due to my cognitive decline. His words, not mine. The woman from the denominational office had moved closer, watching intently. Furthermore, I continued, I've gathered statements from former staff members who were dismissed after raising similar concerns. Richard's composure cracked completely. This is a coordinated attack. These disgruntled ex-employees are bitter about being held accountable for their own failures. Richard, Elder Sarah, our oldest serving elder, spoke his name sharply. She was looking through the packet, her expression grave. Are you saying these bank statements are fabricated? They're taken out of context, he stammered. The ministries I operate outside the church sometimes partner with our programs. It's all above board. Then why weren't these partnerships disclosed to the council? She asked. And why do these transfers list purposes like building fund and mission support when they went to your companies? The room had gone deathly quiet. I can explain everything, Richard said. But his confident tone had vanished. There are ministry expenses that don't fit neatly into budget categories. Sometimes administrative flexibility is needed for God's work to proceed efficiently. The denominational representative finally spoke up. I'm Reverend Martinez from the regional office. I was invited to observe today after receiving some concerning documentation. She looked directly at Richard. Pastor Morgan, these allegations are extremely serious. If accurate, they constitute both ethical violations of your pastoral covenant and potentially criminal misuse of non-profit funds. Richard's face flushed deep red. This is a church matter that should be handled internally, not with outsiders. The denomination has oversight responsibility, she replied calmly. And based on what I'm seeing in these documents, we will be initiating a formal investigation immediately. Richard looked around the room, suddenly aware that he was losing control of the narrative. His eyes landed on me with undisguised hatred. You've been planning this ambush for weeks, he hissed. You're trying to destroy everything I've built because you're jealous of my leadership. I met his gaze steadily. No, Richard. I'm doing this because what you built was based on lies and theft. You betrayed the trust of everyone in this room. What happened next was both painful and necessary. For nearly 2 hours, the congregation worked through the evidence. Some members wept. Others expressed outrage. A few loyal supporters of Richard tried to defend him. But the documentation was overwhelming. Elder Sarah finally stood and addressed the congregation. In light of the evidence presented, the elder board will need to meet immediately to discuss next steps. Pastor Richard will be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Reverend Martinez has offered denominational resources to help us through this process. Richard, who had grown increasingly silent and sullen as his defences crumbled, suddenly grabbed his coat. You'll regret this, he muttered, as he pushed past me toward the door. All of you. The next few weeks were difficult for our church community. The full investigation revealed even more financial impropriety than I had uncovered. Richard had been living a lavish lifestyle far beyond his pastoral salary. A vacation home in Florida, luxury cars registered to his consulting business, first-class international travel disguised as mission trips. The denomination removed his credentials. The church board filed a formal police report. Most of his assets were frozen pending criminal proceedings. Some members left the church, unable to process the betrayal. Others stayed, determined to rebuild. I continued as financial secretary through the transition, working with a professional accounting firm to establish better oversight systems. 3 months after that confrontational Sunday, Richard pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for restitution. The legal proceedings were covered in the local news. His carefully crafted public image was shattered. As for me, I found a strange peace in the aftermath. There was pain, certainly. Trust is not easily rebuilt. But there was also clarity. One evening, I was working late in the church office, reconciling accounts with our new procedures, when Elder Sarah brought me a cup of tea. You know, she said, sitting across from me, I keep thinking about how Richard used to preach, about bringing things from darkness into light. Ironic, isn't it? I nodded, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. He wasn't wrong about everything, just hypocritical about applying it to himself. The new pastoral search committee is meeting next week, she said. We're being much more thorough this time. Background checks, financial history,
Multiple references. Good, I said. Though I've learned that paperwork only tells you so much. Character reveals itself over time. She studied me thoughtfully. You never seem bitter about what happened, about how he tried to discredit you. I considered this as I sipped my tea. I was angry at first, but mostly I'm sad. Sad that he betrayed something sacred for money. Sad that so many people were hurt. But not you. Oh, I was hurt, I admitted. But I also found something I didn't expect. What's that? I gestured to the sanctuary visible through the office window, where a small group was gathering for evening prayer. I realized that my faith was never in Richard Morgan. It was in something much deeper, something he couldn't damage no matter how hard he tried. She nodded slowly. The church isn't the building or the pastor. Exactly. I closed the ledger I'd been working on. Ready for prayer? We walked together to join the others, leaving the financial records secured in their proper place. The evening light filtered through the stained glass, casting colourful patterns across the worn wooden pews. These same pews had heard Richard's booming sermons, had witnessed his downfall, and now held a smaller, but perhaps more authentic gathering. I took my seat, the familiar creak of the wood somehow comforting. The manila folder that had once held all my evidence against Richard now contained planning documents for our community outreach program. Same folder, repurposed for reconstruction rather than revelation. As the prayer began, I closed my eyes. The betrayal had changed me, but not in the ways Richard might have hoped. I was more vigilant, but not more cynical. More cautious, but not less committed. In exposing his darkness, I had found my own light. The quiet strength that comes from standing in truth, even when standing alone. No sermon Richard ever preached had taught me as much about faith as the act of reclaiming it from his corruption. And that, perhaps, was the most unexpected blessing in the aftermath of betrayal.